Amazing. Friends, thank you for joining us here in the Zoom chat, here on the Facebook Live, over there on the podcast. We're here with Rabbi Anthony Knopf, who's the rabbi of Congregation Beth Orah in Montreal. He previously served as associate rabbi at Hampstead Gardens Suburb Synagogue in London and as rabbi of Camps Bay Shul in Cape Town. He learned in yeshivot in Yerushalayim and a kollel in London and a smicha from Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg. He also has a BA in theology and religious studies from the University of Cambridge. He teaches Torah in a way which shows its relevance to the issues people grapple with in everyday life and to social justice. He is passionate about understanding and teaching Jewish values and exploring the ways in which communities can reflect those values. He believes strongly in the power of community to bring out the best in people and to form a space for applying and living Jewish values. He's married to Carly and is the proud father of David, Racheli, Yehuda, and Avrami. And friends, today our topic is Midos in Orthodox schools, character development in modern Orthodox educational settings. And thinking about that, this Rabbi Knopf is very involved in that work in particular. And so at our work, we think a lot about the social change dimension, and we believe it happens from the inside out, that we change ourselves to change the world. And here, Rabbi Knopf is going to guide us in his approach. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Reb Shmuley. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and great to be speaking to you all today. So I hope to chart out a direction which I believe that we should be going in as a community. I want to start from the beginning. I guess we're starting from the premise that character matters. Why? Why does it matter what kind of a person you are? Reb Shmuley mentioned midot. We talk about character in English. Why does that make a difference? We have so many things within Torah which are other than that, which are not that. Many ritual mitzvot, Talmud Torah. Well, look, I mean, some of this is entirely obvious. We have an entire area of halacha ben adam lachavero. So we may touch later on as to the extent to which we succeed as individuals, as a community, some more than others in the halachot of ben adam lachavero, but it's certainly on the books, uncontroversially. We have many mitzvot relating to how we behave to other people. But even when it comes to transcending the halacha narrowly defined, you open up the Pesukim, or even better, you open up a Shulchan Aruch, and you start to learn what the halacha is. The halacha narrowly defined, the black letter halacha, does not really cover the entirety of what we are called to be and to do by Hashem. And there are famous pieces in the Ramban on this, which many people are familiar with. The same idea we also find in the Meiri, in Rav Yosef Alba, and in Netziv, the idea that the Torah does not simply include, or either the Torah itself or even halacha, an entire delineation, a comprehensive specification of all the different actions which we are supposed to do in order to be a good person, and all the specific actions we're supposed to avoid in order to be a moral person. The Torah doesn't do that. Generally, there are different, elsewhere I've written about, perhaps from the perspective of different Torah commentaries, why it's the case that Torah doesn't do that. Some point out it would simply be impossible to cover all different eventualities of social interaction. But it emphasizes for us that when we're talking about the kind of people we're supposed to be from a Torah perspective, just simply observing the halachot involved in Ben Adam L'Chavero doesn't get us there. And even when we can even go further than that. I mean, as far as that goes, we could still be talking about behavior. I could accept that there are lots of mitzvot relating to how to behave towards others. And I could expect that those mitzvot don't tell me everything I need to know about how to behave towards others. And yet still would be falling short in understanding what it is to live a good life in the understanding of the Torah. Because to be a good person does not simply involve behavior. I should say immediately, behavior is very, very important. Within, if you were to talk about different moral systems, there's no question the halakha puts a tremendous premium on how you behave. How you behave is very important. It's how you behave which generally makes a difference to other people. If your moral life simply involves your emotions, your mindset, your empathy for others, but that doesn't translate into how you actually behave, then you're certainly falling short. But our true calling is to internalize and to integrate moral ideas into our way of thinking and experiencing the world. And our behavior almost flows from that, as an expression of that or an application of that. But it goes much more deeply than a list-like approach to certain types of behaviors we're supposed to engage in. The question, therefore, is, if we're talking about what kind of community we want to be, what kind of people we want to be, who are we called to be? It's those who have a genuine interest in the well-being of others, who have an aversion to lying and deceit, who have a sense of connection to and responsibility for our fellow Jews, citizens, human beings, that we have a capacity for compassion. And let me just illustrate a little bit, substantiate the point that I make over here. Firstly, with a point which is made by Rabbi Lichtenstein. The Gemara compares a person who loses his temper to an Eved Avodah Zarah. As Rabbi Lichtenstein asks, or points out, you'd be very hard pressed to find a pasuk or a seif which says explicitly what isur that person has committed. And yet, nevertheless, the Gemara senses that losing of the temper in the most harsh terms, compares it to the most severe of averas. The Chabad HaLevavot, in articulating his project, his understanding of the scope of what we are called to be, and how that is so often neglected in the Torah literature of his time, points out that the most essential part of the human being is the mind, is the way in which one thinks. And so if we were to, from that perspective, just to concentrate on behavior, you'd be missing the very essence of who a person is. We are familiar with the mitzvah of the halachta b'drachav, of following in the ways of Hashem. And there are different perspectives seemingly in Chazal as to what exactly this involves. The Gemara in Sota seems to talk about this very much in terms of emulating divine behavior. So just as Hashem buried the dead and visited the sick and comforted the mourner, so too we should involve ourselves in those activities. There are the Midrash, however, in the Sifrei and also the Gemara in Shabbat, talk about it more in terms of not actions, but characteristics, character traits, that we should emulate the divine character traits. And there's, as always, a great controversy as to where exactly the Rambam ends up on this point. But Rabbi Walter Wurzburger writes and argues at great length that you can see a transition in the Rambam's understanding, that whereas in Sefer HaMitzvot, the Rambam mentions that this involves, that following in the ways of Hashem involve both certain types of behavior and the development of character. By the time he writes in the Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Deot, the Rambam there is emphasizing character. It's about emulating character. And of course, for the Rambam, that's interesting because for the Rambam, Hashem does not have feelings as such. It's really when we describe Hashem, we're talking about divine action. And yet, nevertheless, this seems to be where the Rambam comes to, that it isn't just about your behavior. It's about who you are and what kind of tendencies you develop, what kind of midot that you develop. Just to give one more example, much more recently, from the Musa movement, the Alter of Slobodka discusses in the Parashat Kitiso the sin of the golden calf, and Hashem says to Moshe that because the Jewish people are an amkashei oref, because they are stubborn and obstinate, he's going to destroy them. And the Alter points out this is remarkable, that the Jewish people have just committed this grave sin, admittedly a debate as to what exactly it was, certainly the golden calf, very severe sin, whatever it was. And yet what Hashem says is the reason that he will destroy the people is because not of the sin, but because of the midah, because they are amkashei oref. And this is one of the proofs the Alter brings for this very same point, the severity, the importance of the character, the inner character. I say this by way of introduction, but I think it's important for helping to define where our goals are as individuals and educationally as a community. If our goals in education are to get people to do acts of kindness, behave in a correct way, so we will adopt certain educational strategies. But if our goals are to develop a certain kind of a character, then our scope is much greater. But I do want to, just before I move on, quote from a piece towards the end of the introduction of a beautiful book. I haven't got this, I hope you can see, the book Divine Footsteps, Chesed and the Jewish Soul by Rabbi Daniel Feldman. And he speaks there obviously about chesed, but in a way which I think could be applied to many midot and really shows the texture of the ethical life and of the development of character. Rabbi Feldman says that chesed is a feeling to possess, an attitude to maintain, an action to perform, a personality to develop, a mindset to cultivate, a habit to acquire, a perspective to apply. It is mandatory and voluntary, basic and extraordinary, routine and outstanding all at once. It is a birthright and an inheritance, and yet it is actualized only through personal initiative and commitment. I think in these words, you see a discerning analysis and breakdown of these different areas of what it means to have certain midot. And whatever our approach is ultimately, and certainly we'll not achieve it today, but our project must be to develop a thickened, enriched understanding of what midot mean. On some level, midot are universal. We can speak about most of the midot in terms in which someone very far from Judaism can understand, but to understand the distinctive application and distinctive understanding of the various midot within our system is very important. I want to add, in addition to everything I've said about the importance of character, that our character, the way we think, the way we feel, the tendencies that we have naturally will also impact on how we behave. So even if your only goal is good behavior, to focus on behavior alone is going to be a mistake for reasons that I will mention later on. But this essentially, therefore, I think is a very important project. It's one which I'm engaged with at the moment in ways in which I'll mention a little later. And I'm very, very pleased that Reb Shmuley invited me to speak about it, because we can, I believe, bring out teachings from Torah which are truly transformative. There are distinctive ideas, some of which have changed the world and some of which the world often does not hear. The dignity of the human person, the nature of social responsibility. And the Torah has the capacity to inspire and to lift us individually and collectively if we are committed enough to eliciting and teaching its message. In addition to the power of Torah, I believe in the power of community as well. Community as a place where moral values and commitment are incubated. We can talk a lot about the disappointment that we experience within our communities. I think we can point in valid ways, which I'll get to later, the ways in which sometimes community, our communal ethos, our communal discourse can have a negative effect on character development. But there are also many wonderful things. And it was a Harvard sociologist, Robert Putnam, whose research throughout the United States showed that frequent church or synagogue goers are more likely to give money to charity, to do voluntary work for a charity, to give money to a homeless person, to give excess change back to a shop assistant, and to spend time with someone who's feeling depressed. And some of these examples will be familiar to many of us from our own communal spaces. Community can be a powerful space for creating an environment in which these values are transmitted. So having stated out the case for the importance of character, I want to take a step back and to ask where we are now. Where is the modern Orthodox community? How are we doing with regard to midot, the character? And everyone on this call will have different points of view because we've had a different anecdotal experiences. And admittedly, in today's world where we have so much exposure to different things going on and we're exposed to so many different types of discourse, although overwhelmingly for many of us on social media, which is often the worst place, a lot of our understandings will be based on anecdotes. I will refer to some of what I've seen. There is some research, there isn't a great deal of academic research done in this field, but some which might point in some directions. I have seen academic research which showed that people with strong adherence to Judaism, did not specify Orthodox in that case, but that people with strong adherence to Judaism in this research were people who embraced such principal goals as being respectful, helpful, and polite. That religious Jews in this research appeared to value positive social relationships and social harmony more, and individualistic and hedonistic pursuits less than non-religious people. There was also research done by the Jewish Policy Research Report in the United Kingdom, their report on charitable giving among British Jews in 2016. And they found that the more religious British Jews are, and again, this was just a matter of being more religious, the Jewish community there, engaged community, is majority Orthodox, but the more religious British Jews are, the more money they tend to give to charity, and the more generous they tend to be relative to their means. There was also data a few years back from the US Department of Health and Human Services, and also Renewal, an organization that supports kidney donors. I seem to remember, Reb Shmuley, that you publicized this as well on Facebook, that Orthodox Jews make up over 15% of the living kidney donors in the United States who give their kidney to a complete stranger. So there are many ways in which I think we can see positive aspects of character and exemplary character within the modern Orthodox community. And I don't come from this from a position that everything is doom and gloom. I think, and again, this is maybe largely anecdotal, but I think it will resonate with many people, that there are other areas in which we often fall short. We do often see a prevalent self-indulgence and materialism, what Rav Aaron Lichtenstein referred to as hedonism with glatt kosher packaging. I think that honesty as a value, a virtue, needs much more emphasis, to put it kindly, within our communities. Far too often there is racism. Black members of Orthodox Jewish communities self-report that they do not find often many that they are treated in the same way as other members of the community. We have that. That's not just an Orthodox problem. There was an article a year or so ago in the Forward reporting on this through various communities. But this is something that happens, and I think racism in general is something which needs to be addressed. Certainly the way in which you communicate with those you disagree with. An interesting sort of illustration, thank you. An interesting illustration of this point is a video which I'm sort of remembering from a few years ago. I hope I'm representing it correctly. But the Chofetz Chaim Heritage Foundation puts out these, for the most part, nice and inspiring videos every year on Tisha B'Av. And Charlie Harari was one of the speakers, I remember 6 or 7 years ago. And he mentioned, he said, like, imagine if you're sort of sitting around the table, a Shabbos table, and you say, last Friday night, I had a Shalom Zocher, and it was 1 kilometer away. And it was absolutely pouring outside, torrential rain. What am I going to do? I've got to go to the Shalom Zocher. It's my best friend's sick kid. It's raining. So you know what I did? I took my car keys. I got in my car. And I drove 1 kilometer. I got out. I didn't get wet at all. And then I drove back at the end. And he said, like, sort of imagine like people sort of around the table, kind of nervously, like, what is going on? Like, what is this guy talking about? And yet, said Charlie Harari, when it comes to, say, speaking Lashon Hara, how often do you find that you're sitting at a table of people in an Orthodox community and without any reservation, there's an engagement in Lashon Hara without any sense of nervousness that this is a transgression of halacha? I think that's illustrative of a problem. I'll try to tease out a little bit where the problem comes from. I think that, frankly, sometimes we lose the plot. Sometimes we absolutely lose the plot in terms of the values that are supposed to be driving us. I saw an interesting discussion of this phenomenon on a Facebook feed just a couple of weeks ago. Talked about many instances of this phenomena of people double parking in order that they can make the minyan on time. Of someone reporting that they remember seeing one year on Erev Yom Kippur, some teenagers pushing through to the mikveh without paying. People reflected that the Good Midas Prize is given to the kid that the teachers think can't win anything else, never the Midas Prize. One person pointed out in a very interesting way that this kind of helps us to understand what you see sometimes at a wedding. You're at a wedding and a lot of people are dancing, and you see someone who pushes past you and they step on your foot as they're pushing past you to go to the middle circle to dance with the chatan or with the kala. And they don't even realize that they stepped on your foot, because it's not about you, it's about them. There's a way of approaching life which can be deeply engaged with orthodoxy, and which can be deeply about me, my experience, my spiritual high. fundamentally flawed and can lead to all these kind of problems. In general, I believe that the consciousness that Tikkun Hamidot is at the core of what we're supposed to be doing and being as members of the modern Orthodox community, as B'nai Torah, as Avdei Hashem, is lacking. Yes, we need to be learning Torah. Yes, we need to be following halacha. Yes, we need to be at the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism and fighting the hatred of the state of Israel. But there are other parts which are central to who we are, showing kavod to other human beings, feeling a sense of responsibility to others, becoming a giver, being nosei ba'olim chavera. These things are not footnotes in the Jewish life, but these are things which Chazal saw as being v'halachta b'drachav. So what is the source of this problem? I'm here today talking about modern orthodoxy. Is this a modern problem? Is it an orthodox problem? Or is it a human problem? In what ways are these different aspects of our identity experience the source of these problems, the shortcomings that we have? And when we start to answer that, we can start to find a direction towards the process of improving. What kind of methods might be brought in to be able to get to where we want to go to? And I do hope to give some examples today of the kind of methodologies, but this will really be creating the framework for where I see things going and the kind of conversations I think need to be happening. On the one hand, I think in many ways, the kind of failings that I've spoken about today and the failings that you may all be thinking about when I'm speaking about these issues are human failings. It's part of human nature. A comprehensive discussion and substantiation of this would require a lot of discussion of history, psychology, sociology, philosophy, and there's a lot to be said on that. I want to quote Torah sources with regard to this particular contention I've made. The Gemara in Chagiga says that theft is a sin that a person's soul desires and thirsts for. Now, there's something about human nature that thirsts for theft. Now, interesting and problematic comment, and maybe we need to understand it in terms of a commentary on the Gemara in Bava Batra. The Gemara in Bava Batra quotes the view of Rav that most people are involved in theft. I don't know that most people are involved in theft. Maybe you could argue that way. The Rashbam explains there it's not actual theft, but it's preventing people from getting the profits in business that are due to them. It is, I don't know, avak gezel. It is a subsidiary category. It is in that direction, even if it's not theft itself. What's crucial is that the Gemaras do not understand this as something which is arising in the context of an engagement with modernity, or which arises because of being committed in a certain problematic way or excessively narrow way to halacha, but rather accepts that human nature is not unequivocally good, that there are some destructive or problematic impulses within human beings, and that these are indeed liable to, at least all things being equal, have an impact on human conduct. Another example, the Taz and Yoredea, where it's talking about the Isser of Lotikom, of taking revenge, says that it's common for Jews to stumble in this area of taking revenge, to observe, to refrain from transgressing this Isser of taking revenge. I don't think the Taz means that this is just Jews. Obviously, this is a prohibition for Jews. And Rabbi Shmuley, I'm actually coming to you. You can certainly ask a clarifying question in a second. Let's just finish the sentence. It's not just he's talking about Jews having this impulse. Obviously, the Isser applies to Jews. It's not easy. Someone has done something to you. You want to take revenge. So this again, I want to back up and contextualize before I turn to Rabbi Shmuley's question. I'm trying to explain where some of these problems come from and explain them in general, in terms of general human impulses. Rabbi Shmuley.
Awesome. So first of all, this is so amazing. I just want to ask one clarifying question about the context before we go to kind of how we address this. Most of what we're talking here with character midot has to do with the individual in isolation, or perhaps the interpersonal. But when Levinas talks about not just the encounter with the face of another, but when there is a third in the presence, you're now talking about the political. And so in the political realm, when we look at the systemic beyond the interpersonal, would you say that the question of midot still applies? And what I really mean here is we can talk about tzedakah, what I do with my resources, but is my political ideology in regards to economic justice issues a midot issue? Or would you say that's a separate intellectual political realm that is not primarily about midot when we're looking at the systemic and political in that regard. Or you might say, I should be kind to a person of color, but when it comes to racial justice policy in the political realm, is that also a midot issue, or would you separate that out?
Thank you. So that's a great question. So I think it's absolutely connected to midot. I mean, if we talk about, the work of developing midot, and I think you're absolutely right. It's very, I mean, there's a question of how intrapersonal it should be, how interpersonal it should be, focused inside, focusing on the other. But you cannot develop, I don't think, the midah of rachamim and the midah of achrayot and so on without caring about these issues and without confronting questions of responsibility to protest against injustice and to take steps towards redressing injustice. Those questions have to be on the table. How you address those questions is a big discussion, and people with refined midot and a strong sense of these midot will come to different conclusions. Some people may have a very strong sense of this midot and have not yet developed the knowledge, the education in these areas, but you can't disconnect them. So I hope that answers the question. I think it's part of if midot is about internalizing ethical ideas and applying ethical ideas, then part of that application has to, at least in principle, be in the political realm as well. What that looks like, that's a discussion which involves much more than just feeling responsible. It may involve some technical moral analysis, but I believe that, and indeed, as I'll start to say, as I think I have been saying, all of our lives really should be infused by that sense of midot cultivation as the basis for what comes out in terms of intrapersonal, actually in terms of ben adam lamakom, which isn't squarely within what we're talking about today, and in terms of the political. So I thank you for asking that. That's helpful. And I return now again to this discussion as to the idea of there being certain human impulses, which are not to do with modern or Orthodox, which can impact on how you deal with your business rivals, which can impact on how you respond when someone wrongs you. So again, these are things which aren't specifically modern or Orthodox, they're human. But the question is, are we doing anything about it? Meaning if there's a human weakness or human vulnerability, and it's important to us from our Torah hashkafa that we become people who don't behave in these ways and don't interact with the world in these ways, then we need to start thinking about what are we doing within our educational system. And I don't just mean schools, I mean education, because I think, I don't know, I think maybe even I read something from you once, Reb Shmuley, where you talked about how even you say, well, Judaism isn't for kids or education isn't for kids. It's not for kids, but it's certainly not only for kids. We're talking about learning. We're talking about the multiple ways in which the community leaders and teachers transmit their messages to all ages of the community and all areas of the community. What that has to be done in a way which is going to address some of these natural human propensities we've had, and the ones that I've given are only representative examples, certainly not exhaustive. I want to mention, Agav, just before I carry on, that these kind of weaknesses that that people have naturally does not just lie within Ben Adam L'Chavero. There is an interesting issue which we might touch on. Why, and again, this is really the Charlie Harari point. In certain areas, we're so much more particular on the mitzvot Ben Adam L'Makom than the mitzvot Ben Adam L'Chavero. But it doesn't necessarily, the things we are careful about and the things we're not careful about does not map exactly onto careful with Ben Adam L'Makom, not careful with Ben Adam L'Chavero. And the same Daf and Baba Batra identifies, at least according to the interpretation of Tosfot and Ramban, that there's having a lack of kavanah in prayer and davening is a sin from which no one is saved each day. Everyone's guilty of it each day. And we know from our davening and so on, the requirement is the baseline to have kavanah for every word of the first paragraph of the Amidah, the first bracha. It isn't just in the areas of Ben Adam L'Chavera where we fall short. And I think that's an interesting point to mention, Agav. And can a preliminary discussion of human failings. The modern Orthodox community is, in its lifestyle and to some degree in principle, engaged with the modern world. There are positive values in the modern world. There's lots of interesting conversations. We can talk about autonomy, so on and so forth, how things have progressed through modernity. But it's unquestionable that there are other influences which really no one in today's world can avoid, and especially those who in their cultural engagement have some measure of immersion or interaction, regular interaction with certain spheres of contemporary culture, which are simply not morally edifying. And I think this is very important, because if you want to know why a person behaves as they do, you have to know what makes them tick. What are they passionate about? And I think it's very important to take a step back and to say, what are people in our community passionate about? Because the way in which you're going to see people behaving and the extent to which people have midot up front and center will be affected by the extent to which these things, these ideas, this way of being in the world really matters to them. And all of us today in today's world are exposed sometimes to passions, values, which don't refine us in that way. A great deal of public culture, celebrity culture, political life, the entertainment industry is characterized by the drive not towards character refinement, exemplary interaction with others, but rather to egotism, to the pursuit of material possessions, to the quest for power and sensual satisfaction. I even think a very simple example, forgive the simple example, but these ones are the ones which are just the most relevant in what I see in my immediate orbit. And I go to a place where there's an arcade, my kids want to play on this game, and I see the game is you take a gun and you're shooting at people on the screen, and you're killing this image of a person. Where is that coming from? Is that image that we have children participating in this activity in which they imagine themselves extinguishing the life of a Tzelem Elokim, of one who is depicted as a Tzelem Elokim? This is what's coming to us. Is this what we would create if we were designing our own culture in which people would become passionate about the right kind of things? And so if we're not critical consumers of the modern world, our values will inevitably become corrupted. And any reflection on where we have to go as a modern Orthodox community must involve a reflection on that essential critical component of our engagement with the modern world. Ad can, human problem, modern problem. What about within Torah? What about problems that come through an engagement with Torah itself? Could we say outrageously that actually by becoming more engaged with Torah, Talmud Torah, mitzvahs, Torah community, values prevalent, which are not coming to us through the arcades and through the movies and through the politicians and the celebrities, but through Torah, that itself can be corrupting? And again, a broader discussion would bring from many different disciplines. What about Torah itself? Do we have any sources within Torah itself which can guide us on this? The Gemara in Yoma tells a story of a Kohen who stabs another Kohen with whom he is competing to perform the temple service. How can such a thing happen? Okay, well, maybe he got angry. I don't know, maybe. But then the Gemara goes on to say that everyone who was present, including the wounded Kohen's father, were more concerned with taking out the knife before the boy died to making sure that it doesn't become tamei than with the murder itself. And as Tosfos recognized their remarks over there, you see that there are wicked people who would gladly harm another human being and still take seriously the laws of ritual purity. What is that about? That's simply a human failing. Regular human activity is not to get involved in worrying about ritual purity. Nothing to do with modernity. But a certain kind of engagement with Torah can create that. The Gemara in Nedarim talks about thieves who come, and it's clear from the context this includes those who would even murder to facilitate their theft. What do you do in such a situation? You tell them that the produce is truma. You tell them that they're not going to be allowed to eat it anyway because it's designated halachically for the Kohanim. And so therefore they're going to go away. As the Rosh explains there in his first explanation there, you see there are people who are willing to kill and to steal, but not to eat from forbidden foods. We're not talking over here about a weakness of the will. We're talking over here about a distortion of values, a way of engaging with Torah in which certain parts of Torah become paramount to the extent to which it distorts the entire system through negating other essential parts of Torah. And this was a phenomenon which was recognized and deplored by both the Khatam Sofer and Rav Yisrael Salanta, particularly in contrasting the priority of Ben Adam Lamakom, the neglect of Ben Adam Lachavera. Where does something like that come from? How can something like that come about? And maybe if I'm to bring this into our own world, because maybe we've never seen someone fight over taking a knife out of someone. Maybe we've never seen this example of what to do about the thieves who may be going to murder you. You tell them, but you haven't seen such things for obvious reasons. But maybe we have seen people who, it seems, dafka through their engagement in religious Jewish life, become more arrogant, become more self-centered, become more racist. I want to suggest a couple of ways, of complementary ways of looking at this. The first is based on the Vilna Gaon as quoted at the beginning of the Even Shlema, in which the Gaon refers to the Chazal, which compares the relationship of Torah and the soul with the relationship of rain and the earth. Rain comes down. What grows from the earth depends on what seeds were there, whether it's seeds, whether it's beautiful flowers. The Gaon explains that Torah causes the growth of whatever is in a person's heart. If the basic character isn't there, the impact of Torah is not neutral, but negative. The basic character flaws become exacerbated through engagement in Torah. I think on a simple level, it certainly emphasizes the kind of work that we need to be doing consciously with the younger generation of our community, with the children, developing midot. Truthfully, the development of midot is a lifelong pursuit, so it isn't only for children, but to do so thoughtfully, not superficially. What actually brings about that kind of deep personal transformation, which will then ensure that the engagement with Torah will not bring to the fore these kind of vices which we sometimes see. I think quite aside from what the Gaon is saying, and I think this is a separate point, the work and the attention given to working on our midot needs to be brought into the fabric of our lives as Jews. There are many things which are on our agenda as religious modern Orthodox Jews. There are many values, there are many spheres of life which we give a lot of attention to. One of these is halacha. Black letter halacha. What does the Shulchan Aruch say? Crucial. But what it can often overshadow if it's not properly integrated is the big picture, is the yearning for Kedusha, and is the development of character. And this is a point which Rabbi Yehuda Amital made, in which he said that in the childhood that he remembers, the world he remembers coming from, you didn't find that everything was halacha essential, but that everything is halacha. And he spoke about today's world, or the world in which he was speaking then, in which he says that you're losing sight of Kedoshim to you, like Rabbi Shmuley mentioned before. You're losing sight of the Asita Hayashar V'Atov B'nei Hashem, because you can't just open a sefer and it tell you exactly what that means in order to fulfill that. That's kind of the point in the Ramban's understanding. So if you don't integrate that thoughtfully, not in a slogan way, in a way of throwing out slogans or telling Shalosh Torah about this, but actually bringing it into our world, how do we actually programmatically move in that direction? Understand halacha and midot as part of the same human and Jewish project. The same, I would say, would be from spiritual inspiration. Spiritual inspiration, a fantastic thing. Too often, people in the community are not inspired enough. They are unenthused, unengaged in their Jewish behavior. They are just going through the motions. And yet spiritual inspiration, partly for some ways which we've mentioned already, can be very damaging. And Rav Shlomo Wolber talks about this in Ali Shur in a piece which he calls Frumkeit. He says that there is an instinct towards frumkeit, towards feeling close to Hashem, spiritually connected. And that instinct is not good and it's not bad. It depends what you do with it. And it can be bad. You can so yearning for that connection. That's a particular type of engagement which we do, Baruch Hashem, have in our community. We need to have it more to some degree, where you're yearning for that spiritual connection, for that spiritual nourishment. And everything becomes justified to preserve that high of a spiritual connection. Think of again of that person rushing to dance at the center of the circle in the wedding, pushing through without paying to get into that mikvah and out purified before Yom Kippur, double parking to get to that minyan for a geschmack davening. And so that also has to be integrated, the desire for spiritual connection with standing back and saying it's not all about me, which means it's also not all about my feelings of connection. And I think the final example that I would give over here with this is the integration of various values which sometimes are at tension with one another. Let's take the example, which I will give now, of Jewish loyalty versus how we relate to those who are not Jewish. And we can equally say, if we had time, we could talk about how this works within the Jewish community, but I'm giving an example here. Jonathan Haidt talks about how religion binds us very strongly to those who are like us. It's a very strong binding agent. However, he points out the bad news is it divides us from those who are not like us. He also talks about the fact that in what he calls weird cultures, acronym, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic cultures, the moral energy is directed towards, the moral framing is justice or fairness and caring. But within more traditional communities or conservative communities, you find that there are other values as well. Without going into all of that, one of the things he mentions is loyalty. And being loyal to the Jewish people is a very important part of our value system. And we can think in terms of recent discussions on Israel, how that plays out and how it doesn't, and how it should, where it's complicated. But loyalty itself, the idea of being loyal to your people, is both very important from our ethical standpoint and countercultural. I argue very strongly for loyalty, but I ask the question, what are the stakes of allowing that loyalty to render us insensitive to the humanity of those who are not in our circle? So philosophically and theologically, these two ideas are not inconsistent. Being part of the whole of humanity, being part of the Jewish people, being part of Orthodoxy and being part of the Jewish people. Being part of my community and being part of that community. We have all these circles. We can be part of one and connected to the broader, but in the soul of the individual, who is, for example, let's not go off in a million examples, who is, for example, passionately loyal to the Jewish people and the Jewish state. Too often there is an insensitivity towards those who are not, so that God forbid someone might have the moral sickness to say that because we stand with the state of Israel, that we would therefore minimize the tragedy of Palestinian children being killed. Rabbi Sachs did a lot of this work in integrating Judaism and universalism in a way which is authentic to Judaism's particularism. And that may be an instructive approach for bringing that into our educational system. So to summarize so far, modern Orthodox Jews have human weaknesses like everyone. That's why we fall short. Modern Orthodox Jews are engaged with the modern world. Sometimes those values are not morally edifying. Modern Orthodox Jews sometimes fall short because we fail to integrate ethics into the Torah life, the spirit together with the law, chesed and kavod with the drive for spiritual inspiration, universalism with Ahavat Yisrael. And so where exactly do we go from here? I don't know, it's a good job that my time's coming to an end, but I have started a process. I've initiated an applied think tank, JMEF, the Jewish Moral Education Forum, and we've started with our first cohort in which we brought together educators from different areas of the community, teaching different ages, community rabbis, campus rabbis, those involved in elementary school, high school, middle school, who are engaged in and care about this issue, to try to find a direction based on Torah in which we can approach this issue in a comprehensive and effective way. We want to see a community in which people are passionate about giving to and respecting others, in which people are able to control their impulse for vindictive revenge, in which they're not going to be drawn to violent video games because that's depicting the murder of a Tzelem Elokim, in which they're going to call relatives in Israel during times of tragedy and of trouble and defend Israel, and also give donations to India. And also, if we know that the funds are being given responsibly, to give funds to Gaza, to people to help to rebuild and to help the families that have been bereaved, if we know and are sure that the money will not be taken by Hamas. And understanding that my Jewishness is deeply tied to my humanity, so that if I am unmoved by human suffering, I am lacking in both. How do you do that? How do you teach Ahavat Chesed? How do you bring a community which is being drawn to Ehrlichkeit, people who can feel another's pain? How do you get there? I have some ideas. I think what we're doing at the moment is teaching a lot of halachot. We're talking about lotikon, don't take revenge. We teach about business ethics. Sometimes we give nice divrei Torah about chesed. But if it's just technical halachic laws that we are teaching, people are going to find loopholes. So one of the things that we need is to teach substantive ideas on Torah approaches to the moral life. And we're doing that much less than we're doing the other stuff. However, we can't leave it just in the area of ideas. Plato felt that, or thought that, knowledge was enough for the moral life, but already Aristotle critiques him on that score, and indeed it's not enough simply to know. There's an interesting philosopher, a contemporary philosopher, Eric Schwitzbiegel, who did some research in the university library, which are the library books which are most commonly not returned. And I think he found, if I'm not mistaken, that the philosophy books were most commonly not returned more than any other books in the library. But which area of philosophy were the books most likely or most often not returned? The books which were on ethics. It was the books on ethics that people were reading and somehow not returning their library books. And he develops from this and other research that he's done the idea that, yes, you can have these ideals. You can have this moral understanding. And yet, that moral understanding is not enough to bring you to where you need to get to. I can have a philosophical understanding that I need to give X% of what I own to charity, to philanthropy. I'm not going to do it if I don't care passionately. He says that you need to, it depends how much you care about it. I think he says to himself, he wants to get a B- in morality, in ethics. Maybe it was a B+. I don't want to speak Lashon Hara about it. It was B- or B+, and I don't want to get an A+. This very same point is made by Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz in his book, God, Man, and History, in which he says you need to have an appetite for goodness. It's necessary, he says, I quote, to foster the emotional force of the desire for the good, to increase its intensity and its hold over the emotional pattern of the human personality. And so if we are creating a community of morality and we just teach content, even if it's substantive content, it's not enough, because it's not enough to know what's right. How do you become a community that cares? This, in essence, was a great deal of what the Mussar movement engaged with, what Rabbi Elia Lapian described as taking the ideas from the head through to the heart. And that's not just about caring passionately about being good, but that's part of it. How do values seep through to the core of the self? How do you do that? I believe we need to be looking at best practices in education outside of the Jewish community and bringing it thoughtfully into our communities. But it's worth mentioning that the Baalei Mussar had their techniques which are worthy of consideration. Meditation, contemplation, visualization, chanting. These were ways of making these ideas real within the life of the people, not just the mind. And yet this is very rare, very rarely done within our community. An example with which I'll end this particular suggested direction is the example of Lashon Hara. And this is actually a point which is made by Aaron Hirsch Fried, who is a professor of education, I think at Stern College, or he used to be. And he says, look, if people aren't taught the importance of respecting others, they are going to find heterim for speaking Lashon Hara, even if only for the most juicy pieces. If they haven't internalized the values to feel that you need to respect people, you teach them all of this Shmiras Lashon Halacha, you're not going to get there. And so substantive ideas, that ways of internalizing. That's number one. Number two is midot education. There needs to be social emotional learning to know how to be sensitive and how to behave to people sensitively. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein relates that when Rav Yitzchak Hutner, his Rabbi, lost his wife was bereaved, he went to be Menachem Aval and he sat with Rav Hutner and no one else was there. And they had a one-on-one conversation, heart to heart, and Rav Hutner mentioned that a Talmid Chacham had come to him and told him that he doesn't need to be upset about the loss of his wife, because after all, his wife is in a better place. And Rav Hutner referred to Vayikra Rabbah, in which it says that any Talmid Chacham who lacks da'at is worse than a Nevela. Not any Ploni, any John Doe, any Talmid Chacham. And Rav Lichtenstein said, Rav Hutner raised his voice and said, you can have a Talmid Chacham who lacks da'at, which can direct and guide him so that he or she will act with understanding towards others and interact with them in a civil fashion. Rav Lichtenstein says, I would be reticent to quote this, to say this if I had not heard this from my revered teacher. How do you bring that into the community to understand, as Rav Lichtenstein says there, that you can be incisive in your analysis of a sugya, have tremendous bekias, even knowledge of Torah ethics, and yet you lack dad. This needs to be developed thoughtfully through social and emotional learning. We can use techniques outside our world, which aim for that very goal of sensitizing people to the feelings of others. Educational psychologist Michelle Borba has a four-pronged approach to this with children. I'll quickly bring it to an end now, just by quoting Michelle Borba's, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Michelle Borba mentions that there's an approach called CARE, C-A-R-E. C is to call attention to the insensitive and uncaring behavior that a child does. The child does something wrong, call attention to that insensitive and caring behavior. A, ask the student, how would you feel if this was done to you? R, get the student to recognize the consequences of the behavior. And E, express and explain your disapproval of the insensitive action. A very simple idea, but an idea which I believe, a methodology which can be assessed, which can be measured up for its impact, which can be brought into our world consciously, lest we think that just teaching the ideas and teaching the halachas and so on and leaving it at that is going to be enough to raise our community to overcome these human, modern, and orthodox obstacles that we have towards becoming the people we are called to be.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Rabbi Knopf. This is very passionate and wise and helpful. Our first question is going to come from my teacher, Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill.
You froze.
Question or comment?
So is this, do I read this, or is Dr. Rabbi?
Oh, no, he may have just frozen. It looks like he just froze.
I was frozen.
Oh, he's back.
Okay, what'd I miss?
Nope, just that you are asking the first question or giving the first comment. Yeah.
Okay, so I have two questions, variants of each other. The first one is, this is all very cerebral. I'm glad I now know what you like in the history of Jewish ethics and which modern studies you like. But in a practical level, to change people, the idea that you have to do something to change people that the knowledge alone won't do it goes back to antiquity. So the ways people changed it was studying Musabis Paulus, doing a behavioralistic checklist of here are the mitos to work on, doing 5 things a week. There are dozens of techniques out there. And on some level, just to say we're going to do these things, we're like the hundreds of speeches I heard growing up about people don't daven, but I hear people meditate out there. At some point, the shir has to start in the last 5 minutes rather than end up at that point. Meaning, yes, you could use all these techniques like CARE and a CARE ethic, but in the end I need a concrete, how is this now going to be integrated into our school system in some way? Just to hear the lecture about it, people can then hear the lecture and then just go right back to what they're doing. Question 2, which is a variant. Okay, I live out here in a rather modern Orthodox neighborhood, and a lot of the people are very materialistic, very much interested in their cars, redoing their kitchen, their vacations. None of this registers with them. They've all gone to the best schools, and some of them even 2 years in the finest Hesder yeshivas. But at this point, that's not where they are in life. And more than that, the majority of them are various things like attorneys who do litigation. And they're very morning, they get up and see who they can crush, how much they can lie until you get to deposition, how much they can be mishaker, because that brings in the money and lets them donate to the shul. There's a fundamental problem here that this lecture, they're going to go and even say, wow, that was a great lecture, let's fund your book. But it's not changing their fundamental, what's going on in the community. And while we've skirted with the insider-outsider, and Shmuley did it in a rather nice way, there are a lot of people who can really have no sympathy whatsoever for those outside the community. And that's ingrained in who they are. And once again, I can look out to the street here and I can, gather some horrific statements very quickly. Once again, what does this cerebral lecture do for me in changing them?
Great, yeah. Guilty as charged. This lecture does not do for you anything in changing them. The questions are excellent. Challenging when I hear about, again, you depict it very concrete way, the approach, the business approach, the attorneys that go out to crush to get their money. These are not the low-hanging fruit, right? These are not the low-hanging fruit of the way in which you engage with education in the community. But I'm guilty as charged because of the following. Although in a longer lecture, and I would make certain suggestions of the way to go.
Get the lecture. How do we change them? Practice.
Yeah. Right. So what's a lecture? The lecture is what I was about to refer to was the practical stuff, the kind of methodologies. You're saying, yeah, I understand. Knopf, you didn't just talk about Torah over here. You talked about educational stuff. Very nice. It's not in the schools. It's not happening in the schools, and you've got the whole adult community who are not modeling this anyway. So my view is that this requires a collaboration between educators, which I am facilitating, where people who are actually in the schools, who are in the classrooms, who are teaching, but crucially those who also are teaching the next generation of adult Jews, or adult modern Orthodox Jews in NCSY, and people who are community rabbis who dreaming to have influence. They have influence on their congregants. They're involved in the adult education. If we believe that teaching has an impact, that whilst the people that you're mentioning, as you've depicted, there may not be the low-hanging fruit, the way in which we educate people in schools, not just in content of curriculum, but using the proper pedagogical methodology, the experiences you create, the deeply moving experiences, the way you get them to reflect on those experiences, that's the way in which you educate. So what does this look like? That takes a lot of discussion and research, and expands way beyond the couple of representative examples that I gave. Do I think that this talk tells us exactly how we're going to know? It does not, and it certainly doesn't give us the tools to do it. I want to see a process which leads to the identification and the creation of actual strategies which can be brought into the spaces, the learning spaces. And this is what I've initiated through the Jewish Moral Education Forum. It will probably go in who knows, when one does social entrepreneurship, one doesn't know the exact track that it will go to, but I think this is what I'm aiming for, a synergy of combined work from people who are influencing through teaching Torah, and to learn how to do that in the most effective way, so that the next generation, we're looking at a different landscape.
So Yisroel Salanter, came up and said, I need tachbulos, I need to find solutions. But no Balabatim wanted them. He had to leave Vilna and go off to Kovna, and he was then left with his own Talmidim who wanted to be moralists. In the end, I'm really hearing part of the people who got through, when we get to Kelm, are people who started giving 4-hour fire and brimstone speeches, which got through to people. I'm really looking for some.
I missed that last point. What happened with the fire and brimstone speeches?
It worked. It actually worked. Meaning the question is, I'm really looking for much more. I know the lay of the land, and yes, you teach the educators, and it's very nice, and but will it really change? How do you really start from the point of how do you change things?
Yeah, you made a number of points there. Maybe I've said as much as I can about the process which I'm initiating, which is not one with a predetermined methodology as it's in its vision, but rather one in which, through engagement with psychology and Torah sources, strategies will emerge. What could it look like? Could it look like that certain ways of teaching, impactful ways of teaching, which take account of the actual psychological ways in which moral character develops, are brought into our system? It's an important point about Mussar, historically, that it didn't spread like wildfire in the way in which some other movements, Hasidus and so on, did, and maybe indeed that says something about human nature and not wanting to be not called on to do. You have to do this, you have to sacrifice, and so on. And indeed that might be a challenge. But again, the approach which would be taken within the schools would probably not be quite so preachy. You mentioned the fire and brimstone. Well, I don't think that's going to work today for our circles. But that doesn't mean there can't be other ways in which it can. And if it's brought into the schools particularly, as long as it doesn't just stay there and doesn't become disconnected from anything else happening within the community, I think it can be very powerful. You don't need people to stop following a movement with the Rav Yisrael Salanter if you can get the schools on board. That if is a very big if, and that's the work that I'm involved in. But if we do need to make the case for the importance of this and for the possibility of doing something about it, if we are going to get the Torah teachers to engage with this in this way, in a way which will lead to identification of strategy and implementation of strategy.
Amazing. Oh, amazing. So I would love to continue this conversation. We unfortunately have to pause here, but now we know we have to bring you back for stage 2, and stage 2 will now be let's talk about the implementation. Let's talk about the methodologies. I appreciate Rabbi Brill pushing on that next stage. And the other thing I want to raise is someone who thinks a little bit about moral philosophy is and the intersection of philosophy and psychology on the situational ethics. If people are relatively predictable given the context they're found in, how much do we have to educate the self versus shift the context that people operate in? And how does Musar kind of think about how predictable behavior is given context? And what's our role in that work as well? So this has been great, a fire-up talk on the importance of midot work, and we'll have to continue this on the next level. Wishing you lots of continued bracha and hatzlacha. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Looking forward. Thank you so much.